Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Annie Selleck. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of the Women's Center at Georgetown University. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's event. I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the Gender Justice Initiative and the Women's and Gender Studies program. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carole Sargent, who will welcome us to our event and introduce the author.
And this is fun. I see friends in the audience. And I'm Carole Sargent, founding director of Georgetown's Office of Scholarly Publications. I was originally from the English department until we started this office to guide faculty in all departments and programs to publication in peer-reviewed journals and at university presses. I'm also a book nerd. I'm a member of LGBTQ faculty and first-gen faculty. But I'm delighted to introduce Kaya Oakes. She's an award-winning author, multiple award-winning, and I'm going to go through some of the multiple awards. She's on the faculty and inspires writers at UC Berkeley. And she broadly defines her writing interests this way. She calls it spiritual seeking, charting the spiritual directions of non-religious people for the most part, which really interests me. She's published 4 books before this one. Slanted and Enchanted, The Evolution of Indie Culture with Henry Holt in 2009 was a San Francisco Chronicle notable book. Then Radical Reinvention, An Unlikely Return to the Catholic Church, which is a bit more memoir-like from Counterpoint Press in 2012. And then The Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, Are All Right, a new generation of believers, seekers, and those in between from Orbis Books in 2015. And that was a finalist for a Religion News Association Best Books Award. And, you know, it's interesting, she's Catholic, but the Defiant Middle has a Lutheran publisher, and I smiled because the whole Lutheran Church began basically in resistance to the Catholic Church. But, you know, I like the tensions there, and I also like the tensions in the book. I'm going to hold it up so that you can see it. And a second, I'm going to be able to see it, the Defiant Middle. I like the tensions in the book. It also has, I guess, what I would call the tensions that it holds in a number of different beautiful identities. She told me a great story, too, about engaging with her editor on this book based on a concept rather than the full proposal. I think it's an organic way to connect with an editor and an organic way to grow a book. She has published essays in journalism in the New Republic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Sojourners, On Being, which is radio, but also has a web presence, and many, many more. I got into a Slate piece of hers that I found, and it was about being shushed at a Yo-Yo Ma concert that was outdoors. And this was a place where families and groups could be themselves. To a reasonable extent, it would be normal to make some noise. And she got shushed. And she asks, what happens to us when we turn classical music venues into churches and basically stifle the atmosphere? And I'm a former classical music DJ, and I enjoyed that take. I wondered to myself, how did classical music become a pinned butterfly in a box? She's a contributing editor at Killing the Buddha, a contributing writer at the Jesuits' flagship America magazine. And she writes what I found to be a really intriguing column. I looked this one up too and had fun with it. A column on forgiveness for the Revealer. That's a publication of NYU's Center for Religion and Media. And go look it up and read some of those. It's like a slant version of the New York Times relatable column, The Ethicist. I think it was even, more relatable. She received Religion News Service's 2021 award for Best Commentary Writing. At Berkeley, she's had a Mellon Faculty Institute for Undergraduate Research Innovation Grant, faculty fellowships from Mellon and others. She has an MFA in Creative Writing, and she's done postgrad work in writing and education at Berkeley. And her books get picked up in classes a lot, and I think that's how it probably got bubbled up to Annie's attention. Now I'm going to focus just on the book itself to give you a little framing for it, and then I'm going to give it to Kaya to tell you more. It's quite challenging to describe because it felt like many books in one. Initially, I thought okay, it's about the experience of cisgender women, and she really has wicked and hilarious takes on things like Catholic school. John the Baptist looking like an airbrushed Kenny Loggins, and I was laughing, things like the Eileen Fisher moms. But I wasn't yet relating, and then I did suddenly when she began to bring in fresh, vivid lives of gender non-binary stars. And oh my goodness, these were people, some of them I felt I always knew them, but I hadn't met them before. Others, or didn't know nearly well enough. Others I had never met. I was stunned, for example, when I gloriously discovered the public universal friend, the most inspiring Quaker ever, in my opinion, for the first time. I took a second look through her eyes at Black American activist Pauli Murray, who felt, she had to navigate a gender identity she basically felt relegated to. Oh, I was riveted at this point. I became engaged with lives as she redescribes, from Simone Weil to even a fictional character, trans icon Anna Madrigal from Tales of the City that I read way back in my 20s. Dorothy Day, who never wanted to be a saint and now apparently is on that path, and I think she would have hated the whole idea. I enjoyed really reimagining them in this book. Here's how we're going to do the Q&A. I'm going to let you meet her on her terms for about 20 or so minutes, and then we're going to have time for the Q&A. If you want everybody to read it and you want to share the question, just go ahead and put it in the chat. Annie will select questions for me, and she's going to put them in a Google Doc that I can see, and I'll tee them up for Kaya. Not all questions will be asked because of time constraints, that's life, but she'll get to see them all, and so will we, which is lovely. If you'd rather not tell everyone who's asking a question, then send it in direct chat to Annie. And then she'll share it with me without your name on it. And then, but we can just ask it anyway if we get a chance. That's it. And now, Kaya, it's your world.
Thank you so much, Carole and Annie, and everybody who is here. It is 9:09 a.m. here in Oakland, California, where I live. I'm not in my office at Berkeley. This is the back of my house where I've been teaching, writing, and living in this home office since COVID began. I know it's beautiful in DC right now, and I wish I could be with you in person, but hopefully someday soon. And if any of you ever find yourselves in the Bay Area, and particularly in the East Bay, feel free to drop me a line. So thank you so much again, Carole, for that introduction. I have some slides to share with all of you this morning. So I'm going to go into those. And we've all mostly gotten used to slides, but I'm still a little awkward at them. So the subtitle of the book is I can't remember the subtitle, it's very long, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World, which was the publisher's suggested subtitle. So I gave this talk a slightly different subtitle, How Women Navigate Life Between Expectations and Reality, because I think that's a little more on track to what I was trying to do in this book. I'm happy to talk to you all about publishing today, by the way, if that's helpful at all. But one thing that publishers do is that when they choose those really long subtitles for nonfiction books, a lot of that has to do with search engine optimization and finding the keywords that Amazon will pick up for your book. So when I began to think about this book, as Carole said, I sold this to an editor at Broadleaf Books, which is an imprint of Fortress Press, which is part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America's publishing arm, and they are the liberal progressive Lutherans. And so I met an editor from Broadleaf, is their new trade books imprint. I met an editor at a writing conference, and she and I hit it off. And one of the things we agreed that we both wanted to read more about within the sphere of progressive religion writing was the role of women. And the reason why is because a lot of books in the progressive religion sphere about feminism tend to be a little bit more about women as leaders. So particularly in denominations, Christian denominations where women are pastors, there's a lot of books about how to be a woman pastor. And there's a lot of books about parenting and mothering, which are important books, but there's a lack of books, kind of a gap there for books for a general audience of women. So my idea was, what does it mean to be trapped in between expectations and reality as a woman? How does religion, and particularly because I come from a Catholic background and this event being sponsored by a Jesuit university, very familiar ground for me as a person who writes for a Jesuit magazine. There are some things I can write about in that magazine, and there are some things I cannot write about in that magazine. And I'll talk more about that later if you're interested. But I've myself felt that tension between the history of Christianity and Catholicism, the history of how women have been treated, and the roles that they've been allowed to play within Christianity and Catholicism versus who they really are and what they want to do with their lives. And it was important to me throughout the process of writing this book to find examples throughout of women who were role models for defying social, cultural, and religious expectations. And as I began to read into it, I realized I needed to expand that way beyond the idea of cisgender women into trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people. And the reason why is because a lot of the time those people have challenged our understandings of gender in ways that have in turn affected women and given women more freedom. So there's a cause and effect relationship between a more expansive definition, a more inclusive way of thinking about feminism, and a future of feminism that allows us a lot more freedom. So as you can see, I made a little diagram here. So again, this is the fun stuff you get of 2 years of teaching online, is learning to make diagrams like this in Canva and stuff like that. So you can see here that the Defiant Middle sort of like is at the middle of all these issues: religion, cultural, social expectations of women, ending patriarchal privilege. And again, this is not to say that we need to get rid of men, but that we need to get rid of the unearned privileges that patriarchy bestows on certain people in society, rejecting stereotypes, who are our role models of defiance, and what was our past, future, present, and future definitions of feminism. So as Carole pointed out, there's a lot going on in this book, but more simplistically, it's sort of about that first question or that first idea: how are women stuck between expectations and reality? So when I sat down to map the book out, so I had sold the book on an idea and I didn't have an outline, and that's unusual. For those of you in academic publishing know that the outline is everything, right? So with academic books, the research is leading you into a story that the book's going to tell. In the case of this book, the idea led to thematic connections. And so what I thought about are mind, spirit, and body. So what are the ways that expectations of what women should be affect us mentally, spiritually, and physically? So each of these chapter headings sort of connects to a theme that I break down in that chapter. I started the book with youth and young women because I'm interested in and discovered that there's a lot of conflicting pressures on girls, and experienced some of this myself as a kind of what we used to call a tomboy in my younger years. And what does it mean for girls to be pressured into things like purity culture? I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. And then the conflicting pressure of increasingly pressuring girls to be sexual or sexualizing girls versus things like purity culture, and trapping girls in between expectations. And from there, I went into age and the opposite problem that many women experience, which is that as you enter the powerful years of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 and up. The problem is that our culture is terrified of death and illness and tends to erase older women. And then I really wanted to talk about the trope and the stereotype of dismissing women as quote unquote crazy. I was very happy to see that conversation becoming very public in the last year or two with Britney Spears, Naomi Osaka, and Simone Biles, and very prominent young women who talk publicly about mental health, but we still have this cultural propensity to dismiss women as quote unquote crazy, and that's very destructive. I also wanted to talk about the idea of fertility and barrenness versus fertility. Why do we see women who don't procreate as failures? Where does that come from? What is the problem with that as we move again into a different version of feminism that's more inclusive? The chapter on moving beyond binaries is called BUTCH, FEMME, Other, and that chapter title came from a friend who was in my writing group as I was writing this book, so I give Liz credit for that. But as a lesbian woman, she had sort of had experience with this as well. What does it mean to move beyond binaries, but to discover that there are figures from history who've been doing that all along? And then finally, I wanted to write about solitude, or sorry, first I wanted to write about anger because it's the taboo emotion for women still. And then secondly, I wanted to write about solitude because of course I wrote this book during COVID and I was sitting alone in my office back here writing a book, but also I think that many of us learned during the pandemic that we are capable of being alone in ways that can be kind of empowering. And so I wanted to challenge that idea that women who are alone are pathetic or sad in some way, and claim solitude as an empowering thing. So in the chapter on youth, I'm just going to go through a few examples that I use, and then we can unpack this more in questions that you have, or comments that you want to make. So in this chapter on young women, I talk about the problem of purity culture a lot because I have been working with and studying evangelical women for a number of years now, and the conversation has largely been about purity culture in evangelical and fundamentalist churches, but there is that in Catholicism too, this history of virgin martyrs and the value of chastity. And there's this dualistic problem, which is that even though there was this obsession with preserving girls' virginity, people were also looking to girls like Joan of Arc, who was 13, 14 years old at the time she was asked to lead an army into battle, to be leaders. And we're still doing that today. So of course, I've got Greta Thunberg up here, but I also thought about Malala Yousafzai, who's now married and has graduated from college, and yet is still thought of as this, she's kind of perpetually a girl, that 15-year-old girl who was shot by the Taliban in our minds. And so why is it that we have these dualistic expectations of girls? And what does that do to girls' identities as they grow into women, that idea that they're sort of trapped in between their own expectations and their own realities? In terms of aging, our culture, particularly in the United States, has this terror of aging. I was reading an article recently in the New York Times about getting Botox in your 20s so that you won't ever develop wrinkles, which I found kind of distressing, but it is apparently a thing young women are doing now, so that it's called preventative Botox. And I thought that was such a strange concept, but it's not surprising in some ways. Part of the reason that we have a fear of aging in our culture, and particularly for women, is because we don't have role models of women who flourished in their elder years, and that leads to invisibility and erasure. And I was very pleased recently to see the new remake of West Side Story, and to see Rita Moreno at 90 looking beautiful and singing and being at the Oscars looking beautiful, along with this young queer Latinx woman who plays Anita in the new version, and they were there together, and it was really great to see and hear them talking about being role models to one another. But if you look back into psychology and sociology and religion, we actually can find a lot of powerful archetypes for older women. Carl Jung talks about this in the archetype of the wise old women. In Judaism, there's the Baba Yaga figure. In Native American religions, and particularly in the American Southwest, there's the grandmother spider figure, and this is a Hopi Kachina of her, who is the person who creates the world, is a wise old woman. And then in the Bible, there's the figure of Anna the prophetess, who is present at the presentation of Jesus. She doesn't get to say anything, but at least she shows up. So talking about stigmas around mental health and how we've historically dismissed women as quote unquote crazy and use that as an excuse to punish, confine, or ignore them. Again, this is rooted in history. Throughout history, we have in the Catholic Church lots of examples of saints who were people like Catherine of Siena, who starved herself and didn't eat and had visions as a result of that. And then more recently, Simone Weil, who also died from anorexia and apparently had mental health issues throughout her life. But I was very challenged also to write about people like Sandra Bland, who died in police captivity. And while the circumstances of her death remain very murky, the fact is that she was kind of dismissed as being somebody who was quote unquote crazy. She was out of control. Her mental health was a problem. And so it's unfortunate that these problems persist today, but as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it's some of those expectations of women being normative psychologically and not acting quote unquote crazy are being challenged by women with mental health issues. Particularly, I'm very thankful for the courage of people like Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, who have talked openly about their own struggles with mental health, and more recently, how many people have rallied around Britney Spears and the cause for her freedom, her liberation from her family, and who were basically holding her prisoner, unfortunately. The other thing about another theme that felt very important to talk about was the cultural idea that childbearing is the ultimate fulfillment for a woman. And increasingly, women are choosing choosing not to have children or not having children. And I think it's statistically, and I apologize for not looking this up since I wrote the book, but it was 1 in 10 when I wrote the book about a year or two ago. And I wouldn't be surprised if the pandemic does change that even more, given the fact that the pandemic also revealed a lot of the issues around caretaking and the extreme burdens that were put on working women who are also mothers to both be caretaking and working at the same time. Like many of you, I've sat through a million Zoom meetings in the last 2 years with colleagues and had children climbing on them, babies strapped to their chests, and while they were in Zoom meetings, while they were teaching on Zoom. And again, it just revealed some of the inequalities in our society, but you probably know that already. Sorry for the tangent. But when you don't procreate, why is that seen as a failure? How is that changing? But it's changing somewhat, but it's still seen as a failure. And who are some historical figures who did not have children, but played important roles in their society at the time? And here again, I think a friend of mine who was in my writing group while I was writing this book, who's Jewish, for reminding me of the Purim story, the story of Queen Esther, who saves the Jewish people and who is childless as far as we know. And there turn out to be many other figures in the Bible who do not have biological children. including Vashti, the sister of Moses, Miriam, Mary Magdalene. And so that was kind of refreshing to rediscover that kind of hidden history. Carole mentioned the theme and the chapter on moving beyond the binary, which is increasingly how young people understand gender. And young, by young, I mean my students, but also people in their 30s, 40s, etc. We tend to think that trans and non-binary people are new, but they've also existed throughout history. And they are challenging us to understand feminism in a more expansive way. Some of this comes from Judith Butler, who some of you are probably familiar with, who teaches at Berkeley, and Butler's theory that gender is something that we perform. And so that gender is in some way something that we act out, and how gender nonconforming people help us to understand and redefine our ideas about gender. So throughout history, you could go back further to the early days of Christianity, when you had people like Anastasia the patrician, who lived as a male monk for most of their life, and then other women who went into explorations of different gender identities in Christian history. I'm not going to go too long into that, because I'd be interested to hear if any of you have encountered people like this in your own research. The two people who really lit my fire as a writer, though, are here on the screen. One is Polly Murray on the top, who was a lawyer and a civil rights activist, and later became the first Black woman ordained in the Episcopal priesthood. She was in her 60s by the time that she received that vocational calling. But throughout, and I'm using her pronouns, throughout her life, and many scholars stick to her because Murray used that during her own lifetime. But Murray really struggled with gender. One thing we learned from her diaries, and researchers have discovered, is that she went to doctors throughout her life trying to discover if she was actually a man. And she really felt somewhere in between the two genders. At some parts of her life, she felt more masculine. At other points, she felt more like a woman. But she was always a feminist and always an activist. And then down at the bottom is the public universal friend, who was a Quaker preacher, formed a community in upstate New York that was a spin-off of the Quakers, but had an illness and woke up one day and said, I am now the public universal friend and I don't have a gender anymore. And this again was so far back in history that we've kind of lost the friend as a figure, but that's an illustration of them from the time that they lived in. Anger is still seen largely as an aberrant and dangerous emotion for women, which goes back to the Maenads of Greek history. But unexpressed anger, we're learning, can cause epigenetic problems. The fact that it can actually, when you suppress emotions or you have trauma that you've gone through, that can actually alter your DNA, as we're learning. So Dorothy Day is the example I really drew on in this chapter. I was mostly familiar with her as the founder of the Catholic worker movement, and in pictures like this, where she's at a protest, and being a sort of stalwart figure. But everybody who lived with her and worked with her said she had a really bad temper, and that she was constantly having to suppress it, and she bit her tongue a lot. But that if you lived in the Catholic worker house, you had likely encountered her bad temper at some point in time. So we tend to think of her as this kind of holy figure, a figure of holiness. And we think of holy and spiritual people as not being angry, but like Dorothy Day, many of them were. And so Elizabeth Johnson, she talks about the idea of righteous anger versus everyday anger. I think that's important for women to unpack. So we're allowed to be righteously angry about things like social issues, but if you're just pissed off because you're having a bad day, you have to bury that and push that down a lot of the time. And then finally, like I said, I wanted to talk about solitude. Particularly, I was really interested in Thoreau and the whole American myth of the man who goes out into the wilderness to survive on his own. And as we, now know about Thoreau, who I grew up reading, like many people, that his mother did his laundry and brought food to him. So he really wasn't alone. But I discovered this woman called Sarah Bishop, who was a hermit in New England, and she actually lived in a cave, and it was not this romantic kind of solitude that she experienced. It was trauma. Her family had been, their house had been burned by British soldiers during the Revolutionary War, and she had likely been raped. And so she went into solitude in order to get away from the dangers of society. But it was dangerous for her to be alone too. And I really wanted to think about that question of what does it mean when women embrace solitude, and why is that again perceived as dangerous or unusual? Again, I really leaned on Julian of Norwich in this chapter because I've written about her before, but it was great to return to her as a figure of somebody who, she wrote the first book in English and who was a solitary person, but in her, she lived for most of her life in a cell, a small room attached to the side of the church. And that was a voluntary decision on her part. But one window looked into the church and the other looked out into the village. And I thought that was such a great metaphor for how we live today. Sort of like when we choose solitude, we're still connected to the world in some ways. And then if you're a spiritual person, you're still connected to your spiritual life in some way, but we're always trying as women to claim our little private spaces and time to ourselves. And how can we embrace that? So the reason that I discovered, so as I was writing this book, one thing I discovered is why I was writing it. And that sometimes will happen when when you write a book, is that as you're going along, you discover what your point was all along. And what I've discovered is that I really wanted to write a book that would be maybe a voice to help guide us toward a more inclusive feminist future in which women have more freedom to embrace their agency, more freedom to define themselves, more freedom to move beyond these expectations, and more freedom to be frank about how these expectations impact us. And part of the inspiration from that came from Bell Hooks, who I'm sure you're familiar with. This is from Feminism is for Everybody, which I've been teaching to my students for many years now. This quote, "If any female feels she needs anything beyond herself to legitimate and validate her existence, she is already giving away her power to be self-defining, her agency." So that quote became a real guiding light for what I was doing and what I was writing. And I think ultimately that is what the future of feminism looks like, is us learning to claim our own self-definition and our own agency that history has often denied women. So that's the talk part in a nutshell, and just thanks to Annie, Carole, and everybody at Georgetown, and to my publisher too for getting books out to all of you. But that's a kind of broad overview, and I thought now that it's like we've got like 25 minutes left, I was interested to hear what people are thinking about or want to talk about, at the end of the conversation. So I'm happy to take questions now or talk about anything you'd like me to expand on.
That was amazing. And let me make sure, am I muted? Am I unmuted? I am. That was amazing. I absolutely loved it. And I loved seeing some of the images again and remembering how much I loved them in your book. We do have questions. I did have the idea actually that if one of the questioners did want to be identified, and so I wondered if she also wanted to ask her own question. But I can give her that opportunity. Dr. Adana Johnson asked a question. Do you want to ask your own question, or would you like me to ask it?
Hi, Kaya. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your talk. My question was just, and you started to talk more about race as you went through your presentation, but I was curious about how that fit with your discussion of the crazy aspect of the ways in which women and femmes are characterized, and specifically with Sandra Bland and the intersection of race and gender there.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Obviously, one of the things I'm constantly having to unpack and interrogate as a white person is how to write about people like Sandra Bland in a way that honors their story, or Polly Murray. So when I wrote about Murray, I went to Black women scholars and asked their advice, talked to them about things like pronouns. How do we handle the issue of pronouns historically, for people who lived in a time when there weren't non-binary pronouns, but also what was Murray's, what do these scholars have to say about Murray's understanding? With Sandra Bland, the same way, I looked at essays written by Black women authors about Bland and how her mental illness was used against her during the arrest, how she was treated by the cop who arrested her. At the time when she was in prison, I read the transcripts. I tried to think about what happened, but I didn't put myself in her place. So as a journalist, what you try to do is you try to talk to experts and you try to stand back and let the story tell itself, right? So I tried not to, I'm going to try to imagine what she was thinking. I'm going to try to imagine what she was going through, and instead tell the story according to people who knew her, people who were there around her at that time, and people who've written about this afterwards. So yeah, I always try to step back, and it's the same when I'm writing about the LGBTQ plus community. As a person who has straight privilege, again, I try to, Carole's read the book, so in that chapter when I talked about Murray and Public Universal Friend, I went into third person, right? I turned off the first person microphone and went into reporter mode, which is to take the focus off of myself and to, again, let them tell their own stories. So I hope that makes sense. It's a challenge that we're talking about a lot in journalism circles, and particularly Catholic journalism these days, the problem of a lack of editors of color at Catholic publications, which unfortunately, according to many writers I know, makes it harder to break through to those publications as writers of color. So it's a structural problem that needs to be changed. But again, from my own point of view, I just really try to step back and let the stories tell themselves and not editorialize.
And there was another question that I shared. Dr. Johnson had asked it, but I too had asked it. I shared, and so I'll ask it this time. And it was, I'd be quite curious on what you could or could not address in your writing in America Magazine, or in other spaces like that. And it's not just America. It's maybe Commonweal, maybe Sojourners, maybe other places like that.
Well, unsurprisingly, Catholic media is very uncomfortable with the question of women's ordination. And I was at a writing conference a few years ago at Notre Dame that has not occurred again since then because of the things that it was very honest. There was a lot of honesty at this conference, but Notre Dame, Notre Dame's going to Notre Dame, and it's a pretty conservative place. And one of the things I said on the panel was, as Catholic women, I was on a panel of Catholic writers. As Catholic women, we can't, we have to ordain ourselves to be writers and to speak in the church. But America doesn't. I have a woman editor there. She's great. She's the first woman to rise up to associate editor at a Jesuit magazine. But I'm not going to pitch her stories about, a friend of mine who's a non-binary priest at a Catholic church that's part of Roman Catholic women priests, like that. That's not a story they're interested in. Commonwealth's probably not interested in that story either. National Catholic Reporter might be interested in that story, but even they are kind of uncomfortable with this. I have another friend who is involved in an organization called Catholics for Choice, which is obviously very controversial within the Catholic Church. I would never pitch an article about them to America because they're very, they don't want to acknowledge the existence of pro-choice Catholics. So yeah, it tends to be around body issues and around issues of women and ordination. Those are two of the topics that I haven't written about. I'm interested in how the bills around trans kids are going to play out and what that says in a larger sense about our understanding of gender. And I'm hoping to write about that for a Catholic magazine, because I think Catholics should be concerned about those bills. Because it is an issue that is impacting children and their mental health and their physical health. And so, yeah, those are very dangerous bills. And I hope that Catholic publications will be brave enough to run articles about that. But unfortunately, there's just some topics that are still taboo.
Okay, great. For the last time, it worked out well for me to ask Dr. Adana Johnson to ask her question. So now I will ask Rebecca Cassidy to ask her question. I like to get more voices and faces in the
Thanks so much, Carole. Hi, Kaya. Thanks for speaking to us today. Wanted to ask, as a writer, you have an extensive writing history, but I've dabbled in the art and I have found it to be very, very difficult and very tiring. What keeps you motivated and what keeps you going? Is it more about telling other stories or telling your story, or more about finding out answers to questions that don't seem to have answers, or all of the above?
And just as a note, the reason I chose that question is because I too was interested in the tension between either going inward to answer things from your own heart or looking outward for stories that seem to beg for treatment. I was intrigued by the dynamic she put up there.
Yeah, thank you. I actually had a colleague ask me recently, how do you stay so prolific? Because our job is difficult. When you teach things like first-year writing classes or even research writing, I'm teaching 2 sections of research writing to undergrads right now. It's a lot of work and it's very draining, especially given the situation a lot of students are in right now with mental health, and their problems are, we're all going through it. And I told my colleague, the frank answer is that I don't have much of a social life. I'm very solitary. I don't mind being alone, but that's part of the answer. But more broadly, I think I do see writing as it is my way of being an activist. And it's in that way, it's like a vocation, in the sense that a vocation is a calling, but a vocation it also goes the other way, which means when you have a vocation, you're there to call others to share in your vocation. So one of the things I do is I teach writing workshops on spiritual autobiography at churches. And I haven't done that since the pandemic, but I'm hoping to start again. And the reason I do those, they're free, is I do them for free. I don't charge anything, is because it's often the people who come are like senior citizens who've never written anything. And they're kind of like, looking back on their lives and wanting to tell a story. And we don't give people very good language or opportunities to talk about their spiritual lives. So that keeps me going. And then doing events like this where I get to hear from people who have interesting things to say, you know, that's helpful. But yeah, I think that idea of you don't know who's going to read what you're writing, and it can be very isolating and very lonely. And so part of you has to sort of embrace that as part of the process. But also, I think it helps to always think of writing as a conversation, whether that's between you and another person. In academic writing, that's often your editor, right? Or your students or your friends, or, you know, if it's a spiritual thing, you know, what you define as a divinity in your spiritual life. But just to remember that it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. And again, that, you know, that there is eventually going to be somebody for whom this piece of writing is going to matter. And that can be whether it's just a social media post or an email that you'd send. I just sent my students like a long email on Friday about, you know, I know this semester has been really hard. I'm struggling, you're struggling, but here's why you need to come to class. But it was not like to guilt trip them. It was to start a conversation about just showing up and what that means, you know, to just be present to one another. And I didn't expect it to turn into that when I started it, but it felt important to say those things. And a couple of them already have said, yeah, you know, actually, I wanted to tell you what's going on in my life, and thank you for opening up this conversation. So I think it's important to remember there's somebody out there who is eventually going to need what you're writing. And that, I think, helps keep me motivated, along with things like having deadlines and editors and professional pressure. But Carole mentioned the idea of when do you choose to write about yourself? And with this book, it felt very inauthentic to write about something like barrenness and not mention the fact that I don't have children, right? Or to write about age and not say that I'm 51. I was 50 when I wrote the book. The reason I did that is because in academic writing, there are models of people in the, like Hooks, Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa, who did weave in the personal with the more impartial kind of third person writing, and that toggling back and forth between using your experience as framing when it's appropriate, and then stepping back to let other people tell their own stories can be very powerful, and can also give your students or other emerging writers an agency to try that too. So again, it's like to give, a lot of the time I think of being a writer is just giving people permission to try things themselves. And that's the part of me that's also a teacher, but also like, I think that's really important is to, one thing I do in my creative nonfiction classes with upper division students is I have them write a piece from, first they do it in first person, second they do it in second person, and then they do it in third person, and then they decide whether or not it needs to be in, can they change it up? Like, what does that do when you change the point of view? How does that change the tone? How does that change the way the audience reads it? And that can be very empowering for people to find that part of their voice. So I recommend everybody trying it at some point in time. If you're struggling with a piece or you're struggling to write, just try writing it in a different point of view and see what happens.
Beautiful. And Annie Selleck has a question that she was putting together about inclusive feminism, and I was thinking how to frame it, and I said, I'm just going to let her frame it.
Great. So I was thinking about, you know, you speak a lot about an inclusive feminism and that, and I think that's such a vital call. And I just would love to hear you talk more about what that looks like, right? Especially how can we build a feminist movement? And right, of course, I'm speaking like from the social location of the Georgetown University Women's Center, right? That is very intentionally inclusive of trans women, of non-binary persons, while also keeping in mind like the real harm that feminist movements have done to these communities in the past, and that like especially with non-binary persons, like like many don't identify with feminism or with a women's center or things like that, right? So what does an inclusive feminism look like to you, or I guess what does that mean to you, with a special attention to those areas?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Annie. And again, thank you for sponsoring this event and inviting me. So I write about this in the book a little bit, but I grew up in the Bay Area, so I've always been around LGBTQ and gender non-conforming people in one way or another, whether that's, a teacher at school or, a friend or just people who I interact with on a day-to-day. And I was always pretty open to the idea. I had a friend who transitioned when I was in college, so that was 20 plus years ago, when that was very difficult to do. It's still not easy, but so I was already pretty open to this idea. But what really radicalized me is that I had to have a surgery a few years ago, and I had to have I have a condition called endometriosis, and it affected my menstrual cycle. And so I had to have a hysterectomy and have my ovaries, I have like half of one ovary left. I don't know where it is. It's like floating around in there. But as I was preparing for surgery, I was really stressed out and I was holding a lot of tension in my neck. So I went to get a massage, and the massage therapist was recommended to me. And normally I wouldn't go to a male massage therapist, but I kept hearing people say, no, he's great, he's amazing. And so I told him why I was there. I told him what surgery I was having, and he said, oh, I'm trans. Why don't you, ask me anything? And he was the first person to talk to me frankly about what was going to happen to me, like more than my doctor. I had women in my family who had the same surgery. They refused to talk about it because it's the stigma of shame again about, and so it really opened me up to the idea. At the same time, also a friend of mine was going through breast cancer and she had a mastectomy. And so we were kind of both going through these questions about, are we still women, right? Like if we don't have these biological markers, like if my hormones are no longer what they used to be, and what does that mean? And again, it led me back to this idea that feminism, in order to evolve, it does have to reckon with this idea that gender is not just solely determined by biology. And I've been very distressed by what's happening with these bills and what's happening with J.K. Rowling and her position on trans people. And the anti-trans backlash to me feels like very driven by an agenda. And some of these feminists, they call themselves feminists who push back against trans people, are really focused on the idea of gender as biology. And so I think the more we can have frank conversations about that kind of stuff, like I was deeply ashamed to talk about having a hysterectomy because it felt like, again, it felt like taboo, it felt wrong, but it changed me, and it changed my idea of gender. And the masseuse that I went to, masseur, just the fact that he was frank and open about hysterectomy, it again helped me to understand more broadly how bodies change, but our brains change too. And so I highly recommend, there's an episode of the TED Radio Hour. I'm not a huge fan of TED Talks normally, but I do use them in class sometimes. And there's an episode, I'll try and dig up the link, on gender, and it's for scientists and scholars of science. And one of them is trans, and she's a biologist. And she talks about how there's this possibility that in utero, our chromosomes change. And so there is a possibility that one of the reasons gender dysphoria may exist is because somebody's gender changed in the womb, right? But then our gender also changes with menopause or hysterectomy, or your visible markers of gender change if you have breast cancer. And so I think it's, again, just being frank. To me, Annie, you asked about like, what does that look like? To me, it just looks like my students and like this kind of glorious diversity of gender expression that we see at Berkeley and you probably see at Georgetown, and this willingness to just kind of understand. And one of my students last semester had a really good depth, so I'm going to steal this from them, which is that in the future, we'll still call it feminism, but that'll be a nod to its history and the history of the movement, but it won't just be for cis women anymore. We'll call it feminism in the sense that that was something we're building on, but we're also deconstructing the harms that feminism has done to women of color, to gender nonconforming people, et cetera. So again, we're honoring some of the history while we also take away the dangerous parts.
Okay, and again, here's the beautiful book, The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World by Kaya Oakes. Here's the back with all of her glorious blurbs from Krista Tippett of the On Being Project, and she's had some really beautiful blurbs that you will also want to read. I'm going to give it back to Annie Selleck to say goodbye, but I want to express my deep appreciation for having the opportunity to do this. I love talking about books. So if anybody wants to publish a book, come and talk to me.
Well, thank you both so much. Kaya, I loved how you said, what does this look like? It's our students, right? And I think of, in the Women's Center, in the LGBTQ Center, and so many other places at Georgetown, that's true too. The students are leading the way, and it's a matter of whether as institutions, we look to them for that leadership or not. So thank you for that. Thank you for all of you for joining us today. Again, we do have copies of the book in the Women's Center. So we're in the Levy Center in room 327. So just off the elevators in the Levy Center by the credit union. And we have copies of this, so please come by if you haven't read it yet. Please feel free. I know it's a hard time of the semester, so maybe you pick it up as like your summer reading, right? But you can go ahead and drop by and do that. I'd like to thank both of you, Kaya and Carole, for joining us today and for leading us in conversation. You're such gifts to our community, and thank you for being with all of us today. And please, everyone, join me in thanking them today.
Thank you so much.
It was wonderful to be together, and we will post this on YouTube if you want to send it to others. And thank you so much.
Yeah.